started though, because I don't want to, I don't want to take too long. Hi, Susan. Nice to see you.
Hi, Amber. Nice to see you too. I love these classes.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, we have a lot of fun with these classes too. And we always talk, of course, about the community and how important it is to us. So I think everybody on here knows the rules, the no ruled rules. So let's go ahead and get started. I'm just gonna go ahead and I think at this point, go ahead and mute everybody. But certainly please take yourself off of mute if you prefer to. If you have any questions, please use the chat box. Jeff, I hope that as we, especially because we're talking a lot about Lisbon today and the surrounding the Lisboa IGP and the surrounding DOCs, I hope that you'll share some of your insights from spending a month in Lisbon. If anybody else has been to Portugal, please share your insight. So last week, we were joined by my friend Bruno. He might try to pop in, but we'll find out. So Bruno is a good friend of mine here in New York City. He's the wine director at Tocqueville Restaurant on 15th Street, so just north of Corkbuzz in Union Square. I actually met Bruno on a wine trip to the Republic of Georgia in 2016. So we ended up getting to know each other with another group of wine professionals over about a week and a half. And have always really stayed in touch since. So he is a great wine educator and a wonderful, wonderful advocate for all things Portuguese wine. What I'll go ahead and do, I did last week, is I sent out like some information how to find him on Instagram. He does a lot of virtual wine tasting with Portuguese producers specifically. He does not just Portugal. He's a very well versed in the world of wine, but born and raised in Lisbon. So Portugal and promoting the wines of Portugal is really a passion for him. He does a lot of great virtual wine tastings, a lot of interviews with Portuguese winemakers, and a lot of educational reviews on not just Portuguese wine, but the entire world of wine. He's part of a fun Instagram group called Summation Live, which is sommeliers from all over the US who contribute to tasting notes and virtual Instagram live videos. And of course, because it's on Instagram, it's all free, which is really amazing too. So if you did get a chance to join us last week, you probably heard a lot from him. But today, you'll be hearing from me. So if he jumps on, we'll hear from him. But so Portugal, I think if you did join us last week, certainly the last thing that I want to do is be redundant when we were sort of focusing on the northern part of Portugal. But there are always things that bear repeating, right? We need the context of the entire country before we can really dive into some of these individual regions. So Portugal is small. It's a small country, smaller than the state of Kentucky, 370 miles long, 125 miles wide. They have 600,000 acres of vine. The reason I put this in here and I find it to be important is because maybe we often think, or maybe it's just me before I started sort of studying the wines of Portugal, that the wines of Portugal were kind of homogenous, that there wasn't really a lot of wine coming out. I knew about Port, Madeira, and Vinho Verde. I didn't know a lot about the other, especially still and dry table wine coming from the country. They're making a lot of wine. They're growing a lot of grapes. Jeff mentioned earlier, maybe before you jumped on, that he really always finds when he's in Portugal that the blend is where it's at in Portugal. And this is very, very true. It is the land of blends. It's very uncommon to find varietal wines. You do find, especially in the South, which we're going to be talking about, some more IGP style wines, VR style wines. We'll talk about that terminology based on more international grape varieties. But they have more than 250 of their own identified indigenous grape varieties in the country itself. And I think they've sort of moved away from fortified wines, and maybe that's not the correct term. Maybe, they haven't necessarily moved away from fortified wines that we think about. They make fortified wines in many places in Portugal, not just the Douro or Port or just Madeira. We'll talk about a few others of those. But as fortified wines have become maybe commercially less important in the world of wine in recent years, the producers have really, in the past 50 years, turned to their indigenous grapes and turned to their traditional blends of these regions and really stepped up the game. And we're very, very lucky that we're talking about a country that is the last frontier for wine in Western Europe, right? It's in Western Europe, it's right under our nose, but we don't talk about it even as much as we talk about Spain, which is its counterpart on the Iberian Peninsula. The wines are inexpensive, but they can be difficult to understand because of an uncommon language, uncommon grape varieties, uncommon regions, etc. So that's why we're here to really kind of dispel a little bit of maybe the timidness that we have in considering Portuguese wines, because we just simply don't know what they are. So growing a lot of grapes, making a lot of wine, the Portuguese drink a lot of their own wine as well, and they're 11th in world wine production. This tiny country, Kentucky, the size of Kentucky, 11th in terms of world wine production. I think that that's pretty incredible. Let's talk a little bit about the background and history. We'll go through this pretty quickly because I know you guys are shocked, right? Amber, quickly talk about history. It won't happen, but we're going to try so that we can really focus on some of these individual southern regions of Portugal. Well, the Dark Ages, the Moors come in, Germanic conquest really almost eliminates viticulture. The history of Portugal in some ways is in tandem with the history of Spain and the Iberian Peninsula in general. In 1250, Moors were expelled from the northern parts of the country, and very similar to what you see in Spain, the Moors had a much firmer stronghold in the southern part of the country than they really did in the north. Once we came to the Douro River, they didn't really extend too much further north, and the rain that they had there left much less of an imprint than it did in the south. In places like the Algarve, in places like Lisbon, you go to the city and you see the beautiful architecture that was built. The Moors were really important in the Iberian Peninsula because during this time, most of Christian Europe was in the Dark Ages, and they were illiterate. There was unfortunately a lot of famine and disease, and the Moors really pushed for education, especially in the Iberian Peninsula. They built libraries, they built universities, right? They brought a lot of different food that we consider to be food or spices or things that we cook with that we consider to be like Spanish or Portuguese, really came from Northern Africa. So, but the Moors were expelled. Portugal does affirm its national identity. In 1386, this is really important, Portugal signed the Treaty of Windsor with England. So this establishes one of the world's very first and oldest alliances. It really paves the way for a lot of extensive trade. The English would purchase inexpensive wool and fortified wine from England. They would take that wool to England, they would make clothes out of them, they would sell them back to the Portuguese at an inexpensive price as well. And that extensive trade had really continued, and also that kind of military alliance had really continued for centuries since this time as well. Even as early as the 20th century, we were calling on Portugal. England would call on Portugal for aid in some of its islands and other places of the world. In 1419, they develop a great navy, discover the island of Madeira, which we'll talk about today. In 1678, we discussed port last week, so we won't focus on it too much, but two Englishmen discover Porto, which is a sweet fortified wine. So I've heard before, Jeff, I have never actually been able to look up the measurement of a ton, but I think it's what they use, the terminology that they used during that time. I keep it here more for the idea that you can just see the difference and the increase in how much wine England began to import. So Jeff was just asking here, if you look a little further down, so 427 tons, 1,400 tons. And I don't know what the exact translation of tons is or what it would use during that time, but I think it's just more important to show 427. In 1678, when the English discovered port at an abbey in Lamigo in the Douro Valley, versus 1685, right? Not even a full decade later, which I think is pretty crazy. If anybody does know what a TUN is, oh, great. I love having you guys on chat support. This is fantastic. So this also is really advantageous for Portugal. There's a lot of war and embargoes happening during this time between England and France, and this also results in a boom for sales of Douro and Portuguese wines. During this time, a lot of these English, and not just English, but also some German, some Holland, not Holland, the Netherlands port houses are established during this time. Some of the most popular that we think of today, Croft, Taylor's, Worey, the two major houses that own a lot of the smaller brands today being Taylor's and Symington. Now, the wine became so important and so popular. Portuguese wines were accounting for 2/3 of all imported wine into England. We had a lot of fraudulent wine. The demand was more than the supply of the wine. We started seeing a lot of the Douro wines or port wines that were being tampered with. They were, lesser quality grapes. They were not aged for as long. They were adding coloring or sweetener to these wines in order to meet the demand of the wine from England. So in 1756, the Portuguese government, of course, said enough of this. And they established the Douro Wine Company. And this installs a lot of regulations and eliminates a lot of fraudulent practices within the Douro. And the Douro was one of the first wine regions in Europe to really be formally regulated and formally defined by a geographical area as well. Now, today, the Douro Wine Company has lost power. They survive today as the Royal Oporto Wine Company, but the wines of the country are regulated today by the IVDP, the Douro Port Wine Institute, as opposed to this Douro Wine Company that was regulating the wine during the 1700s. So the English defeat Napoleon. This is really important as well. This had a lot to do. The very first time that Napoleon wanted to march through the Iberian Peninsula, through Spain, he requested permission from Spain to march through Spain to attack Portugal. The Portuguese, of course, called on their alliance with England. England sent a young colonel who would eventually become the Duke of Wellington, who would not only beat Napoleon as he was about to march across Spain and invade Portugal, but also later on at the Battle of Waterloo, which is pretty cool. Phylloxera entered the Douro in 1867, and a lot of vineyards are not replanted after this time. And the cork industry takes root, especially in the south, in places like Alentejo. We'll talk about that as well. We begin to really delimit the first region, Madeira, Dow, Vinho Verde, in 1929, recognizing the quality and the historic importance of a lot of these regions already. We begin to revamp the Portuguese wine industry, but unfortunately, a lot of these small vineyards are consolidated. Co-ops really take root, and quality suffers in the 1930s. A lot of these areas around Lisbon, which we'll talk about soon, suffered under co-ops as they were producing a lot of wine to supply other colonies around the world as well. So we skip forward a little bit post-World War II. Sweet and semi-sparkling rosé, Matou and Lancers are really important. We talked a little bit about Matou with Bruno last week, and kind of the idea of what Liebfraumilch or Blue Nun did with Germany, right? Was it took an area that was kind of unknown at the time to a lot of outside wine drinkers, kind of to wine drinkers that maybe wanted just something for the table. They weren't too serious about learning a lot more, but they got this Blue Nun on the table. It was a little bit sweet. It was kind of fruity. It was really easy to drink. And Matou and Lancers really fit the same bill for Portugal, but they brought a lot of recognition to Portugal, where before this, maybe a lot of people outside the region or the country wasn't aware of a lot of these wines. So really historically important in terms of the global outreach that these kind of major brands had for these sort of sweet semi-sparkling wines. And we transitioned to democracy in 1974, and it's a little bit earlier than what we see in Spain. And in 1986, just like Spain, they're admitted into the EU. A lot of these co-ops lose their monopolistic powers, which is really important. And we begin to kind of move the DOC system to the DOP system in 2009, formally additionally classifying the DOPs to DOP to maintain EU protection. So as always, we talk a little bit about what that means, right? So here we are, right? The great navy of Portugal sailing out to claim riches of the world. When they found Madeira, they were trying to sail to the east, trying to find places on the spice route. Here we have a bottle of Matu. If anybody's had Matu or Lancers, I'd love to hear your opinion of it. I always say it's kind of like one of those wines that I haven't had the opportunity to try, and I want to. I want to understand what that's about, because, you can't knock it if you haven't tried it. All right, so let's talk about the Portuguese quality system. The original system prior to joining the EU in 1986 was similar to what we have now. It was just reclassified and amended in 1986 in order to fit in with EU regulations, and then again in 2009. So the original system, known as the DOC, today has 31 regions that qualify for DOC. Now, this is the top tier quality of Portuguese wine. So Vinho Verde, Colares, Porto, Douro, these are all DOCs within the region, meaning that each region itself or each DOC has a set of laws governing which grape varieties that you can use in almost every region. These are blends. Sometimes or many times the region doesn't stipulate that it has to be a blend, but it's a minimum percentage of maybe one or two specific grape varieties, and then most producers craft blend. There are some exceptions, especially in Mansal e Malgaco, if you find in Vinho Verde in the north. We also, underneath the DOC, this is like the center of the bullseye, right? As we stricter regulations, less authorized grape varieties, more regulations on quality, minimum alcohol levels, minimum or maximum yield in the vineyard, right? As we move a little further out on the bullseye, we have the IGP. So very similar to like Italy's IGT, France's IGP, traditionally labeled, they're known as VR. So interchangeably, you can use the old nomenclature on Portuguese wine bottles, the DOC, or you can use the EU DOP. In most countries, producers are allowed to choose whether they use their traditional legislature or nomenclature or the EU nomenclature, even though they mean exactly the same thing. We also have the IGP, as I was just mentioning, 14 regions, more relaxed regulations based more often on geographical boundaries. The IGP is what you're most commonly going to see your international grape varieties released as, or your varietal wines, right? Your Syrah, your Cabernet, your Pinot Noir, your Chardonnay. Those are going to be released as IGP wines. More relaxed regulations, larger geographical boundaries regarding where the grapes themselves can come from, and more relaxed rules around winemaking, yields, minimum and maximum alcohol level, and so forth. Like every country, we have the vinos de mesa, the table wine. These would more commonly be wines that are consumed within Portugal, not as commonly exported. The less expensive wines of the region that might be drank in villages and so forth. You also see Garrafeira. Garrafeira is not just a minimum for aging, although it does have minimum aging requirements in order to use the term, but it's telling you that these are the top wines coming from Portugal. So the top wine coming from the Douro, the top wine coming from Bairrada, which you see here. This is from a company called Sograp, one of the kind of biggest companies that you find within Portugal as well. They were, I think they're the owners of Matus now. So Garrafeira Tinto will be aged for a minimum of 30 months with 12 in bottle. Branco or white wine, 12 months with 6 in bottle. I never want to tell consumers of wine that they have to memorize minimum aging requirements. What should you know when you see these terms? You see a wine labeled as Garrafeira. They're telling you that this is one of the top wines of Portugal. So you see Garrafeira in every wine region. It's only eligible for DOC and IGP wine. You can't use it for a table wine, a Vino de Mesa within Portugal. And then you'll also know that because these are top quality grapes, top quality in terms of the production of the wine and how it's made, that the wine can age longer. And it has been aged longer at the property, which for us as consumers tells us there's more tertiary flavors and aromas, right? Less immediate overt fruit, and a little bit more about that leather or earth, spice, dried flowers characteristic, those aromas and flavors that develop in the bottle with age. You might also see Reserva. In many countries, Reserva usually indicates longer aging. In Portugal, it's only telling you that there's higher alcohol, 0.5% minimum higher, according to the appellation standard. So each one, of course, will have minimum requirements, but this is at least 0.5% higher. Usually that's an indication that it was a better year, a better harvest, healthier grapes. You might see Colheita Seleccionada, which is a minimum of 1% higher alcohol than the appellation requirements. Such fun stuff. So today we're talking about the South. We got a little history on the country, of course, of Portugal itself. Now, the South especially, and you can see this if you go to Spain, you can see this if you're in Portugal and the Iberian Peninsula, you do have the lasting influence of the Moors. You see this in the architecture, you see this in the mosque, you see this in a lot of the kind of agriculture and that of the country itself, especially in Lisbon, or maybe going to somewhere like Sintra, where you have a mix of Christian and Moorish influence in the architecture that's really beautiful as well. So today we're going to kind of cut right through this area. So the Tejo River, which runs through Spain, also known as the Tejo, so Tejo here, Tejo in Spain, I guess you would call it, really kind of split through the region of Lisboa, which we'll be talking about today. We're going to talk about all of Lisboa, Lisbon itself, the capital city of Portugal, the wine growing regions that are around it, the Península de Setúbal. We're going to talk about the 9 DOCs that are located within Lisboa itself. We'll talk briefly about the Algarve, although not probably a lot of wine that you would see coming out of the Algarve in this region. We'll talk about Tejo and Alentejo as well, of course. So let's go over a few grapes. I don't have the entire list on here of everything that we'll talk about. Many grapes grow in all regions of Portugal. This is not uncommon, but some regions and some DOPs and some IGPs or VRs certainly have grape varieties that they're more focused on. Today, we're really going to be talking about Castelão. This is one of the main red grapes of the south of Portugal. Before we get to the islands really have kind of their own thing going on. So we're going to talk about the grape varieties of those particular places when we get to them. But Castelão can be fuller. It can have a meatiness to it. It tends to have red fruit. It develops a really beautiful cedary characteristic with age. Touriga Nacional is much less common in the south. This is considered to be Portugal's finest red grape, but it's only 10% of the vineyard within Portugal itself. The majority of Touriga Nacional is planted in the north, in the Dow, La Foz, and of course the Douro Valley, where we use it for port, and also for dry red table wines located within the Douro itself as well. Touriga Franca, you'll find in small amounts and blending in the south. Baga is at home in Barada, but in some of the more northern Lisboa DOs, excuse me, not DOs, DOPs. Sometimes I mix up my Spain and my Portugal. Sorry, allergies make my throat kind of scratchy. Baga, you will see in some of the northern areas of the Lisboa, some of the northern DOPs, which we'll talk about. You see a lot of Aragonés or Tinto Roriz, which is the same grape as Tempranillo in Spain, and also Trincadera for red. So a little bit more kind of bright, fresh acidity, raspberry, fruity, tutti fruity characteristic of wine. Alvarinho really should probably come off of the southern Portugal slide, but it's such an incredibly important grape for Portugal. I couldn't leave it off to the side. Sorry, guys. So, you know, grown in Vinho Verde, really important, the same as Alvarinho, across the Minho River within Rías Baixas in Spain. We're going to talk today about Fernão Pires, or also known as Maria Gomez. So these are the same grape, but depending on where you're at, you might see them listed by one name or the other. This is the most planted white grape. It's been long considered a workhorse, but as we're finding in so many wine growing regions in the world recently, I think this is one of the most exciting kind of new developments that's happening globally in the world of wine, is that so many producers are looking towards these kind of maligned workhorse grapes. And they're saying, no, there's something here. Just because the grape was mistreated doesn't mean it's not capable of making great wine. And I think that that's something that's really funny and really awesome that's happening in the world of wine. So concentrated in Barada and southern Tejo, where we see a lot of white wines in Tejo, not a lot of white wine only regions or white wine dominated regions within Portugal. Vinho Verde in the north. Tejo tends to make quite a bit of white wine. Bucelas, which we'll talk about in Lisboa, also focused on white wine. And Talvez, we find in Alentejo. This has more of an aromatic tropical characteristic to it. And then we see a lot of these steely whites, right? So the top ones are a little bit more aromatic. They can be softer. These steely whites like Arinto, one of the most important grapes that we're still really seeing coming out of Portugal today. It's an old indigenous variety found throughout the country, but it's best on the coast in Lisboa, especially in the Bucelas DOP, which we'll talk about. And Cruzado, we do see it in a lot of blends, but it's a grape variety that's becoming really important within the Dow region, a little bit further north, so we won't talk so much about that. And the Sanya Cow, also in the Dow, you also find it in blend further south. Same grape as Serchal, highly acidic. They call it the dog strangler, one of the synonyms that they use for the Estanya cow grape. So we're also going to be talking, of course, about wine from Madeira, the white grapes of Serchal there. Of course, we'll talk about Verdelho, Boal, Malmsey. We're going to talk about a lot of that fun, different things. So let's take a look at some of these vineyards, some of these areas. You know, 600,000 acres of vines. Most of them are in regions that aren't that easy to grow grapes. This is kind of a land of extreme viticulture. And, you know, unfortunately, in some of these areas of extreme viticulture, there's a lack of interest because it's really hard to work these grapes. It's hard to work these vines. Because Portugal is so focused on its indigenous grapevines and the terroirs that they grow best in, you know, most of the time they're not planting, you know, wines, you know, we're not taking Baga, which need to ripen so it's not so astringent, or Ramisco, which we're going to be talking about. We could probably take Ramisco. It's a grape that has a lot of acidity, a lot of tannin. We could plant it further inland in, you know, Porto Alegre or Alentejo, and we could say, here, it's going to be easier for you to ripen in this warmer, drier climate. But then you don't get the sensibility that that grape might necessarily be known for, right? So in Portugal, they really maintain a lot of these traditions around growing these grape varieties in the areas that really make them the best. And so that's why it's kind of our duty to find out what that is and make sure that they continue to do that, right? By buying the wine, voting with your dollar. So we're going to talk about Pico. This is the main wine producing island in the Azores. You can see that the vines are planted in these kind of stone troughs that are built to protect the grape from the wind in this area. Porto Alegre, I thought it'd just be fun to put this one a little bit further inland. This is actually an estate that's owned by Symington in Porto Alegre and Alentejo. It's one of the sub-zones of the Alentejo DOP that I think the best well-known and also the highest quality, because we're in the foothills of the mountains here, the highest and coolest subzone of Alentejo. The island of Madeira, of course, crazy viticulture here on a mountain, in the clouds most of the time. The average grower in Madeira has less than half a hectare of vines. So it's really these shipping houses that produce Madeira, and now some of these kind of smaller, really cool producers that are cobbling together grapes from these vineyards and from these producers. And they really drive a lot of the economy around grape growing on the island as well. And then Colares, where there's only about 17 hectares of vines remaining. They still grow in the sand. We have some further inland that are on a harder, more clay-based soil, but the best Ramisco vines, the wine that I was talking about, we have an example here, are grown in trenches dug into the sand on the beach. So it's an area that was not affected by phylloxera. I'm having a lot of fun. Just check and see how you guys are doing, checking out Wikipedia. We should do after these classes because you know, you go through an hour and then every now and then, and sometimes I'll correct myself in a follow-up email, but like sometimes you just say the wrong thing. You know what I mean? Like sometimes you just like say something and then you're like, that's not, I don't know why I said that. That's not right. That's an incorrect fact about a particular region. It'd be kind of fun to like go through these classes and be like, let's fact check or let's see what changed since then this point or that point. So we'll talk a little bit about Lisboa. The city of Lisbon is incredible. It's gorgeous. We can say that we have more of a Mediterranean climate, but we're not on the Mediterranean, right? But then again, not every region that we say is a Mediterranean climate is on the Mediterranean, but Portugal is not on the Mediterranean. The most Mediterranean climate that we might have is in the Algarve, further south, which we'll talk about, where you do have a little bit more of a warming influence. But we're going to talk about the kind of the coastal Lisboa IGP, this larger encompassing area that we saw. I might just go back to another map. Oops, am I going the wrong way? Sorry. You guys get to see all the rest of the slides first. So this larger VR or IGP that encompasses these 9 DOPs or DOCs that we're going to talk about. So Lisboa also is a little bit of a cooling climate in some ways. I'm reminded a little bit about when Mark Twain said, and Jeff, I'm not sure what time of year you were there, but maybe you can confirm this or not confirm this. Maybe I'm totally wrong, but you know, Mark Twain once wrote, the coldest winter I ever spent was a summer in San Francisco, really talking about the influence that you have from these colder ocean currents and the effect that they have when you have a bay, right? So we do have some of this cooling influence on the coast, which creates some of these DOPs that are really important for the production of white wine. So we're going to talk about the IGP a little bit, and then we're going to dive into these individual 9 DOPs or DOCs. Yep, same in Lisbon, wind and fog off the ocean. Oh, Jeff, you're in San Francisco now, right? So yeah, that makes sense, but I'm glad that I brought that up to you. So the Atlantic, as we mentioned, variable, unpredictable, and the quantity and the quality can vary alarmingly. So grape growing really is a challenge here. And one of the reasons I really bring this up is because Lisbon is kind of an area that long suffered from a poor reputation of low quality wine that are made by cooperatives. But you do have an area that's sort of difficult to grow grapes, right? The summers are warm and mostly dry. However, during the harvest season in the fall, there's a lot of variable weather. So, producers really struggle with getting their grapes ripe, especially if they're growing red grapes, where you want to make sure that the tannins are ripe, the acidity has softened somewhat in the grape before you're making wine from it. And then the kind of impending seasonal rain that does come in because we have a more mild and wet climate throughout the winter after the harvest. So these producers are really balancing this ripening in this area. We've seen throughout history a lot of incredible fine still wine, a lot of fortified wines, and a lot of co-op wines that were supplying the overseas territories that have dominated the production of Lisbon at different times. Today, the co-ops are being diminished in terms of their size by competition from private producers. I would say 50 years ago, Portugal was almost entirely co-op dominated, except for maybe places like Madeira or places like the Douro. But today we really see a lot of private producers, and it's incredibly exciting. The southern DOP zones, so Bucelas, Carcavelos, and Colares are known for producing historically exemplary wine and really fantastic wines today. But these regions are really shrinking due to the urban expansion of Lisbon itself. So today we do also see some of these northern DOPs that are showing quite a bit of promise as well. So 9 DOPs, let's talk about every one of them for like 10 minutes each. I'm kidding. We'll go through this fast. So in the north, I think Encostas d'Aire is one of my favorite DOPs that I've kind of gotten to know recently and have some of the wine from. Alentejo is also important. We see primarily, we're going to be talking about the newer styles of these regions as being focused on dry whites and dry reds. And a lot of these regions are focused primarily, so we'll talk about Arinto, especially around Lisbon. It's a really important grape variety. Again, that kind of like steely, ageable grape variety, has a little bit of salinity coming out of this area. The reds are primarily based on Castelão, is one of the main grapes that you'll see. Also Aragonés, that grape that's the same as Tempranillo that we see in Spain. The Encostas d'Aire, or Aire, primarily based on Arinto as well, red based on Aragonés, but there's a couple of subzones. And when I say, the reason it says whites based on, reds based on, because these are blends. You're very, very rarely finding a varietal wine coming out of any of these DOPs. We're really talking about blends. In most areas, they do want the best quality grapes to be the focus. So there's a minimum percentage for, let's say, oftentimes it's like a minimum 50% of combined Aragonés and Castelão, which are considered to be two of the best grapes. And then the rest can be grapes like Baga or Trincadeira, Touriga Nacional, which is a really great grape, but doesn't grow quite as well here in the south. There are two subzones. So it looks like there's 3 subzones here, but there's 2 subzones of the Encostas d'Aire. This is the exception to the rule that I just told you, right? We're talking all about blends. If you see Encostas d'Aire and you see Aurum on the label, the whites are Fernão Pires and the reds are Trincadeira. If you see Alcobaça, the whites are based on Fernão Pires as well. The reds will be based on blend of Aragonés, Baga, Castelão. So very similar, but I think we're a little bit further in the south with this subzone. And then not a subzone, but a style of wine also coming from the region is Medieval de Aurum. This is a blend of white and red grapes. So it's 80% Fernão Pires, which is a white, and 20% Trincadeira, working on my Portuguese pronunciation. I hope you guys will join me. So we can all do it together. But these wines will be very much like kind of a light red or a very deep colored rosé, because they're primarily white with a little bit of red blended in. Now, as we mentioned before, near the capital, Bucelas, Colares, and Carcavelos are really disappearing due to the expanding overpopulation. Carcavelos is hit the hardest by expansion. Only 25 hectares of red wine grapes are remaining from this area compared to what they used to have in the past. They're making wines of all styles. So they're doing white blends from Orinto. They're doing the red blend based on Castelão, but they're also known for their fortified styles of wine. Sweet wines, they are aged in barrel for a minimum of 2 years. So you do see some of this coming out of Carcavelos. We also have, that's the number 9 down here. As we move up, so I skipped ahead, we have Colares. Colares we're going to talk about in a little bit more detail because we have a wine from Colares today. Now, these sandy soils prevented phylloxera within the region. Today, the region has ungrafted vines. They're planted in trenches. We saw that picture just a couple of slides ago. These vines that are really just planted on the sand. They're in trenches, so essentially you can't really plant the roots only in the sand. So they usually will dig about 6 to 9 feet deep until you reach the clay underneath. They'll plant the roots in the clay so that they have something to hold on to. And then the grapevine will grow out of these trenches. And oftentimes, I don't know that you can really see well in this picture, but they'll take, like sticks or bamboo or kind of whatever you find, and they'll prop up the vines themselves to allow for that airflow. So the grapes aren't just, kind of laying in the sand. That would probably not be great for airflow. It wouldn't be great for ripening. It would maybe encourage on wet sand, mold and mildew, although we're a little bit further in. So you can see how extreme it is to really grow grapes in this area of Colares. But because they were never affected by phylloxera, the vines are ungrafted. They were very popular during the phylloxera time because they were producing a lot of wine. They also said that the wines reminded, a lot of the English said the wines reminded them of wine from the Medoc, which of course was hard hit during the phylloxera time as well. And we see primarily the wines based on Ramisco. Ramisco is a grape variety that sometimes I compare the palate to more like Nebbiolo, maybe Sangiovese. It's a grape of extremely intense acidity and tannin. Again, think about growing these vines on the beach, right? So when it ages, and it needs to age usually a minimum of 10 years, you get this haunting complexity that developed to it. But it also, because of that structure, it ages so well. This is a 1999, and it still smells mostly like fruit, which is pretty incredible for a 22-year-old wine, right? So next we'll talk about Bucelas, which we mentioned. Bucelas is number 8 here, also close to Lisbon down here at the bottom. Get my cursor. Bucelas is for white wine. So the wines are based on Orinto. You have that kind of steely character, less than 25 kilometers from the Lisbon center. So it's really quite close to the city itself. As we go to Lourinhã, known for aguardente as opposed to still table wine itself. So these are all not fortified wines. Aguardente is more like a brandy, like a distilled spirit made from grapes. And then we also see Arruda, red wine dominated, Torres Vedras. Torres, it was called originally, but it was challenged by Miguel Torres, kind of the really famous Spanish winemaker. So they added Vedras, which was one of the villages within the region, to the name, and Obidos, which is kind of a cooler area, Obidos. So we're seeing the production of a lot of whites for sparkling wine in this area as well. Moving on to Tejo, Alentejo, Península de Setúbal. So Tejo is probably one of the regions that we'll talk about today that not as historically important that I'm aware of, and also not producing a ton of wine that's being exported. A lot of the wine here is also consumed locally. So we're in a landlocked region in central Portugal, and very few landlocked areas in Portugal. The Trás-os-Montes, of course, we have the Douro, we have Tejo, but even Alentejo has a little bit of coastline to it as well. The wines here tend to be a little bit more bombastic. We do see a large production of white wines coming from Fernão Pires within this area, outnumber the reds that are coming from Castelão. The single DOP, which is do Tejo, inside of the larger Tejo IGP that we can see on the map here. But a lot of bulk production, unfortunately, more basic quality. But it's also important because it's agriculturally a very fertile region, as is Alentejo a little bit further in as well. If we move south of Lisbon, we have the Península de Setúbal. So the peninsula that we talk about is this sort of like chin or nose that kind of juts out here. This is the most important area historically on the peninsula. The IGP encompasses 2 DOPs. Palmela DOP is really important for red wine specifically, but also producing white, rosé wine, sparkling, and liquoroso. So liquoroso is the fortified style of wine that we're going to talk about as well. 2 distinct areas in Palmela DOP. The low-lying sandy plains that are east of the town of Palmela tend to be better for your Castelão, some of your red grape, excuse me, that you see. Setúbal DOP. These are really primarily for fortified wine. So you see Moscatel de Setúbal, and this is really interesting. So prior to admittance into the EU, they used Moscatel de Setúbal. Their laws regarding the region within the country only stipulated a minimum of 70% of Moscatel, but EU stipulates that in order to call it a varietal wine or list a single grape on the label, it has to be a minimum of 85%. So they actually had to change their legislature for the region to increase the minimum percentage of Moscatel, it's Muscat of Alexandria, that was used in the bottle or in the wine in order to call it Moscatel de Setúbal. Otherwise, they could only call it Setúbal as a kind of fortified wine. These are wines that are like perfect with anything over Christmas dessert, right? Fruitcake, Christmas pudding. They develop a lot of spice and orange flavor to them as well. They can be really beautiful. We also have a style called Moscatel Roxo, the red version of Moscatel. I wanted to look into this and find out if it's the same as a grape variety that we see on Elba, which is it's called Aleatico, the coast of Tuscany, which is a pink or red skinned variant of the Muscat grape or Moscatel grape. It produces wines that tend to be a little bit more aromatic and floral. The wines of the region historically were really important. They would also undergo, just like the wines of Madeira, the torna viagem, meaning they would be loaded into the hold of ship and they would make one trip across the tropics to the New World, and then they would actually come back. And just like the wines of Madeira, they really began to take on a lot of these cooked and oxidized flavors that we really love in some of these styles of wine. So Alentejano, so the larger IGP, 30% of Portugal's landmass. I mean, this is the Portugal of like, a lot of Portugal is pretty mountainous, right? We have the ocean, we have mountains. Here we get into an area of rolling plains, cloudless skies, vast horizons, you know, a lot of not just viticulture, but agriculture, animals in this area, incredibly expensive. It is a warmer, hotter inland growing season. We're not incredibly far from the Atlantic Ocean, but we are far enough, and there are so many smaller mountain ranges that do kind of protect some of these inland areas, that we do have wines that produce more, or grapes that produce wines of higher alcohol, lower acidity. it's not uncommon to use the blends of these regions to really ensure that we can produce a wine that has enough freshness to it here as well. Irrigation is absolutely necessary in these areas, these more arid plains. We have the DOP, Alentejo. So Alentejano is the IGP. Alentejo is the DOP with 8 subregions. Earlier, we mentioned Port Alegre. It's the most northern subregion of Alentejo. It's located on the very cool granite slopes of the mountain range there. It's the most promising area in the region because it is the highest altitude, the coolest region. They're doing a lot of great things with red wines that are based again on Castelão, and also Trincadeira is really common within Alentejo. Cork trees, we make a lot of here. We're going to talk about those in one second. And then a really historical traditional wine of the region is the Talha wine. It actually has its own DOC, Vino de Talha. These are large clay pots, a very traditional way of making wine where you would actually stomp the grapes on the floor of the winery, and they would run into these sort of submerged or underground large clay pots where they would ferment. Oftentimes we would seal the wines after they had been fermented under a layer of olive oil, which is still really common, to protect the wine from oxidation. So not just olive oil, there were other things that were used, but really important to see olive oil. Also in Portugal, you see olives everywhere. Aceitunas is what the Moorish name for olive. I know that because if anybody's been to what's it called, Casamona or Bar Ramon in New York City. It's also just like north of Union Square. They have a lot of fantastic, of course, Spanish food. But the Talha wine important in the region. So you might see Vino de Talha telling you that the wine is made in these clay pots, these Talhas or tinajas, as we call them in Spain, you might have heard of as well. So you can see some of those. These are smaller ones. For a long time, they were kind of relegated at the wineries as more of like, a curiosity for tourism, but we're beginning to see the importance of reviving the traditional winemaking styles in this area. I thought it'd be really fun to talk about cork tree harvest. I don't want to keep you guys too late tonight, so how cool is this? Whoever thought about how we actually make cork? So we know it comes from the cork or the bark of the cork tree, right? Harvested every 9 years. The cork bark does regrow. So they'll actually mark the year of the harvest on the trunk of the tree to make sure that we're not over harvesting or harvesting too soon. When the bark is harvested too young, it might not be thick enough to actually make cork from. So you can see the cork tree at the top where the bark has just been harvested from the tree, and you can see on the bottom. And it gets to this bottom process by boiling these large planks that we're stripping off of the tree. The planks become more flat as we boil them. The planks become I'm really sorry about that. I've never had this issue during a class before. The planks become flat. And as we boil them, they're softened and the boiling cleans them. Boil them over and over until any sediment or impurities run out. Excuse me. We cut the planks into smaller pieces, and we begin to punch natural cork out of the bark of the tree, which you can see here. Hand punching or machine punching, much like harvesting. You can see here, I think, although I don't know from this photo, I'm pretty sure that this is hand punching, because you can see where they've skipped some of the areas where we have imperfection in the cork, which, hand harvesting or hand punching is another guarantor of quality, because you can avoid any of these areas with imperfections, right? After we've punched out our natural cork, however we choose to do it, this will be ground essentially, or it will be ground or cut into smaller pieces where we might make agglomerated cork, meaning we put it together with a food safe glue, which you see, or you might see the diam corks, which are pressured together with air. So they don't actually use any glue like they do in some of these agglomerated corks, but they're pressured together by air, and they also hold really well. Diam corks should not get any cork taint because of the way that they're treated before that. Okay, the Algarve. So now we're in the southernmost IGP on the mainland. You actually unfortunately can't see it as well on this map, but it's just the bottom part here. It's more important of an area for tourism. It's a hotter seaside climate. We're getting into more of a Mediterranean style climate here. A lot of native grapes in the area. We're still focusing on Castelão. We're seeing Tinta Negra, which we're going to talk about in a second. But more than 70 grape varieties are authorized. There's 4 DOP zones. Each one of the 4 DOP zones is dominated by a cooperative. You're more likely to see these wines if you're vacationing here. It's a great vacation destination in these seaside towns. Also really well known for figs, almonds, oranges and lemon can be really common in the region too. Moving over to the Azores, a series of, I believe, 9 islands. 3 of these islands have their own DOP zone. So the most important of which is Pico, which we saw a photo of the vineyards themselves. These are the most highly regarded wines of the archipelago. Pico and Biscoitos are both traditionally known for fortified wines, although they have recently, the legislature has been amended to also allow dry table wines within these regions, primarily focused on Verdelho. So Verdelho is the main grape. We see Arinto dos Azores, which is its own variant of Arinto. It's not quite the same that we have on the mainland, and also the grape Tarantes. Gracioso is the 3rd DOP that you might see, also making some dry table wines, sparkling wines within this region. The fortified wines of Pico are still seeing minimum 16% ABV. They age the minimum of 2 years in barrels. Oftentimes they're aged for longer. You saw how they're sheltered from these sea winds. And we're hearing, I'm starting to see, there's a lot of mainland producers that are now coming over to the Azores and making wine, which I think is really exciting. And Anselmo Mendez, the great winemaker in Vinho Verde, makes white and red wines in Vinho Verde, making really great wines here in the Azores. Antonio Massanita, who's located in Alentejo, is doing some really great things in the area. So I think we're going to see a lot more of these styles of wines that we oftentimes associate with, like Santorini or the Canary Islands, these other volcanic islands that are located in other parts of the Atlantic or the Mediterranean. I think we're going to start seeing white wines coming from Pico or Biscoitos or Gracioso that are similar in style to those. Lean, mineral, zesty, salty, right? Let's finish off with some Madeira. Madeira. It's actually pronounced Madeira. I tried to make sure that I went through and practiced my pronunciation of all of these regions so that I would be giving that gift to you. But I so often hear people say it as Madeira. The actual pronunciation is Madeira, and I'm going to start attempting to use that in my everyday wine speak to honor the wines of this island. So also an archipelago, 600 miles southwest from mainland Portugal. Now, of all of the islands of the archipelago, there's only 2 islands that are inhabited. So one is Madeira and the other is Porto Santo. There's 2 DOPs that you can use to cover the wines of both islands. Madeira is the DOP for fortified wine, and Madeirans is the DOP for unfortified wine, which we're seeing a lot more of coming from the island. Unfortified wines have always been made here. There's always been a thriving local market for these wines. Maybe you visited the island, you've been to Funchal or some of the other areas. We saw the pictures of these terraced vineyards. They're trained in the pergola system because this is more of a tropical climate, kind of like the Canary Islands that we find also in the Atlantic, right? So much more tropical climate. It's a moist, kind of a wet climate for grape growing. These pergolas help train the grapes, increase airflow, and protect against a lot of this fungal disease that might happen in a wetter climate. High elevation, lots of rain. We build these canals that actually siphon the water down from the tops of the mountains at the top here. Madeira is really dominated not by co-ops, but by these larger shipping companies that do purchase their grapes from smaller growers. As I mentioned, most growers have less than half a hectare of their own vine. So kind of like you can imagine, these producers have grapevines in their backyard, but they're commercial grapevines. They're selling them to the larger shipping houses or even to some of the smaller winemakers on the island as well. So the main grapes are, so we see for Madeira wine, the Madeira wine, the fortified wine, so Rill, the driest, Verdelho, neck driest. We also have Boal and Malmsey, and then the main red grape of the island is a grape called Tinta Negra. So about 85% of the production, but we don't use Tinta Negra on the label for the wines of Madeira. So usually you see like a Madeira wine that's labeled as something like rainwater. It's usually based primarily on Tinta Negra. So if Tinta Negra is the only really red grape that we're, not the only red grape, but the main red grape that we're talking about in Madeira, how do we get brown wines? Well, heat and air, the sworn enemies of every winemaker, most winemakers, every winemaker that's not making this style of wine conspire together to turn Madeira into one of the world's most singular and also most resilient wines. So, you know, air and heat are the enemies of wine, but Madeira has already been through air and heat. They're no longer susceptible to the ravages of time as most wines are, because the ravages of time usually introduce heat or introduce oxygen. So we'll talk about that process. So Rill and Verdelho, these are white grapes. We usually don't see any skin contact. They're usually mostly dry or nearly dry when we produce these styles of wine. When you see Boal or Malmsey listed on the label of Madeira, these are sweeter styles of wine. They're fortified, more closer to the beginning of their fermentation so that they leave more residual sugar within the wine itself rather than being fermented into alcohol. There are two main processes that we use within Madeira to produce wine. So the first is the estufagem system. Now, this is the kind of lower quality way to produce the wine. You don't have to age the wines quite as long. We create this heat inside of a tank, which we circulate hot water through these coils, which heat the wine inside of the tank. And this caramelizes these sugars over time, a minimum of 3 months that we see this. And then the wines do have to age in cask, which is where they gain their oxidation. So first they're cooked, then they're oxidized. Cantairo are the preferred method for producing these wines. This is one of the most original methods that we came up with after the Tornavia, where we realized that shipping these wines from the island of Madeira, you know, is one of the last places to stop and refuel your ship before you went on to somewhere like Brazil, somewhere like the Caribbean. So they were stopping here, they were filling the whole of the ship with these wines. They would use them as ballast that they would go across the ocean and of course drink them. But sometimes not all of these barrels would be drunk, they would come back. These are these wines that kind of went round trip, and they would noticing that these wines that were oxidized and cooked were incredibly special and still really fantastic. Can you do this with every wine? No, but these 4 grapes that we talked about, so Rill, Verdelho, Boal, and Malmsey, are so intense in their acidity that they can actually withstand this travel. So Cantairo was sort of the initial system that we developed to mimic this going across the ocean in the wormholes of these ships, where the wine would be warmed in the sun for 2 years and then aged in these attics. So in cask, you're in the attic, it's warm, the wines are cooking, the wood is allowing for some oxidation. Today, we can do it in the quicker estufagem process, but this is the preferred method. And this is the most of the wines that you see. If you see the wine on the Social Verdelho Bois Momdi on the label, they actually have to be made in the Cantiro method. Those ones can't be made with those single varietals listed in the estufagem process. You might see the rainwater wines that are going to be more common to be made in the estufagem process themselves. Colheita, these are a single vintage, minimum 85% of the year. Most Madeira wines are not listed with the vintage themselves. They have to spend a minimum of 5 years in cask. And you also see Fresqueira, this is a single vintage, a minimum of 20 years in cask themselves as well. Sorry about all that coughing, guys. That's really embarrassing. I apologize. So that's been happening to me. I've never had seasonal allergies before, and this is like the first year ever, or at least I never realized it before. And it's been a whole thing that I'm getting used to. So we have 2 wines to talk about. I can't remember exactly who had the wines on the call. I know a couple of people I don't think were able to jump on that have the wines, but I think that these can be really fun to oops, sorry. I think these can be really fun to talk about. So the first one is a still wine. So this is DOP Madeirens. This is a Blanc de Noir. So this is a white wine made from red grape. It's 100% Tinta Negra. So this is Diana Silva. Her project is called Ilha, meaning island. And she created this trilogy of still wines, the first kind of trilogy of this style that is coming from the island, all made from Tinta Negra. So there's the Blanc de Noir, the white wine, there's a rosé, and also a red. We already know this is one of the most historic and emblematic grapes of the island itself, much like some of those mainland grapes, is that the fact that the grape itself is not as good as it could be, or how it was grown and treated for so long. So we're really seeing that we can make some fantastic wine coming from Madeira, coming from the Tinta Negra grape. She's purchasing her grapes from small farmers on the northern side of the island, the village of São Vicente. This is really cool. Let's just talk about this. She's the youngest winemaker right now in Madeira. This is the first Blanc de Noir to come from the island. For a long time, it wasn't uncommon. A lot of the wines that were consumed locally on the island were also made from hybrid grapes. A lot of hybrids were introduced post-phylloxera on the island itself. Does anybody have this wine? Rachel, did we send these to you? If you're still here. So I'm actually really happy I've had this sitting out. When I first opened it, it's a little bit reductive. A little bit kind of matte thick characteristics. Sometimes you get that when a wine has not seen any oxidation. So this wine is only in stainless steel, fermented and aged. It has a little red fruit to it, which is really cool for a white wine, right? It's got a little bit of that cherry. It has a little bit of smoky intensity to it. It's very mineral and kind of salty. Like I can feel it in my nose, which is kind of odd for a white wine. Usually I get that little bit of alcohol tingle up in the bridge of my nose from red wine. It's so intense in its flavor. It had this really kind of almost like pomegranate and like kind of tart pomegranate, tart cherry, and cranberry-esque fruit and acidity to it. It's so sharp, but it's also really kind of like lemony and salty at the same time. This is delicious. This is the kind of wine you just naturally want to drink with any type of seafood, bacalao, sardines. It even has enough, like, even though it's so kind of salty and has so much acidity, there is also texture to the wine, which is really interesting. It's like really I'm starting to feel it on the sides of my tongue and the sides of my mouth after I've taken a drink. This is Antonio Bernardino Paulo de Silva. So this is his Chitas winery. They were founded in 1898. They're one of only a few private bottlers still left in Colores. I just wanted to talk a little bit more about the region because I wanted to focus on it here as opposed to earlier on. We mentioned it was one of the world's great wine regions. They earned their fame, the vineyard, by surviving phylloxera in the 19th century, but they really almost succumbed to the commercial pressures of what's happening now and to the expansion. A lot of what used to be the vineyards has been whittled today. And, you know, I mean, these are now seaside villas and apartments by the sea, and what used to be the vineyards in Colares. Even as early as early or as late as the 1930s, we had 1,800 hectares of vineyards. Today we only have about 17 hectares of vines altogether. So Ramisco is the most important red grape that we see in the area. I think the wine, a minimum 85%. This one, as far as I understand, is 100%. So it's kind of hard to find some information. Like, I couldn't find any information on how the wine's actually aged or how it's made. But we know that it's been aged probably quite a long time at a property before it was released here. So 1999, Ramisco is the grape. High tannin, high acidity. It's really fruity, like surprisingly so for a wine from 1999. I get a lot of beautiful kind of berry and cherry characteristic to this wine. A lot of herbal characteristic, and the fruit is a little bit dark and serious, right? Like, you can see how it's been maybe dried or macerated a little bit because of that age. It's not just like fresh and flirty, right? It's got some intensity to it. Definitely has like some potpourri and cinnamon stick characteristic as well that we see in the wine. Wow. I'm just gonna say, so like, I'm gonna bring this half, I Corvined it. I'm gonna bring this half bottle of wine back to Corkbuzz when I'm back there on Thursday, and I'm gonna see if I can pour or sell this by the glass, because this is a really special wine. I took it from Corkbuzz that I think everybody should have the opportunity to taste. It had definitely softened on the tannin on the palate, but you feel that tannin and the sharpness of the acidity as well. You could easily pair this with anything you would have Nebbiolo or something like Sangiovese with. It has a little bit darker fruit. It's a little bit plummier than something that you find for, I think, Sangiovese, or that you find for Nebbiolo. So I see some of that Bordelaise or Medoc-esque richer, plummier fruit here in terms of the flavor. But the palate definitely is a little bit more astringent, but in the best way possible. Jeff, I saw that you were holding down the fort in the comments again. Well, thank you guys. What else can we talk about here? Some cool comments. I'd love, if anybody had an opportunity to try these wines, I'd love to hear what you think about them. It's really fun to be able to talk so specifically about the south of Portugal, and I'll probably maybe send out the first video that we did on Thursday about the north with Bruno too, because I think having a video to see the rest of the context of Portugal and hearing that firsthand experience is really fantastic. All right. Thank you, everybody. It's Tuesday night. Enjoy your evening. Drink some great wine. Enjoy dinner. I'll talk to everybody soon.
Thank you.
Bye. Thank you.